All right, welcome everybody to Advanced Creature Anatomy. For those of you having deja vu, I apologize. This is, of course, the class where we're going to work on developing a creature design toolkit, a mental toolkit, of course, for your designing practices, not an actual yellow and black plastic toolkit that I send you full of creature parts. You know, that's kind of frowned upon by the post office. So instead, what we're going to look at this week and for the next 5 weeks is how to create realistic designs, not simply by going, wow, that's a cool realistic design, but by being able to break them down into their kind of constituent anatomies. Now, I am assuming that everyone who's here today has seen the free webinar. I will touch upon anything that's absolutely vital from there when we get into the topics today, but by and large, I'm using that as a spring pad so we can cover more today. Okay, so for today, we're going to look really briefly at what's going to come in the coming weeks and also what you can expect out of this class, because having taken lots of classes myself, I always like to have a kind of a feel for what's going to happen so I can be prepared for it. I'm going to give you the briefest possible anatomy primer ever, at least for a course that is on anatomy. And then we're going to jump right in and start looking at the nuts and bolts of anatomy today. And then, of course, at the end, we're going to look at some stuff in ZBrush, and I also want to describe some potential projects you could do if you aren't using ZBrush, since I know at least a few people who are interested were doing more traditional media. And indeed, the concepts are best when you apply them, and it almost doesn't matter what tool you choose as long as you're like reinforcing the knowledge, so it'll be there for you next time you design something. Okay, so what are you going to learn? Briefly, we have 5 weeks. Today will be nuts and bolts, or gross anatomy. We'll be covering all that stuff that when you look at an animal is really obvious. Next week, we're going to get into the nitty-gritty. That'll be, we'll probably finish off limbs next week after a preview this week, but then we'll get into the real details of what do hands and feet look like in different situations and what functionally is a good choice. We're going to also look at things like skin covering, head, skulls, as well as like lips, beaks, that kind of stuff. Then week 3, we're going to start getting into more specific applications. We're going to look at hexapods, how to make things that have 6 legs or more. With recent movies, that's become a pretty popular trend, and it's something that's done a lot, but done with sort of remarkably little imagination so far. We're going to look at flying creature design in week 4. If any of you like dragons, as you can see, week 3 and 4 are sort of going to play right to your strength, but you don't have to do dragons to take advantage of these. And then week 5 is where we'll get really kind of crazy, and we're going to start looking at how to like combine, say, arachnid parts with vertebrate parts and stuff into a plausible creature, since you're always going to be asked to design that like crazy thing, or if you want to do it for yourself, you may not want to be so easily constrained in your imagination by just like what you've seen on our planet, but you still want to put them together plausibly so they read. I think it was just mentioned, but I highly encourage you guys, if this is your first one, especially to take a lot of advantage of the community page. If you go to the page on the website there, that's yellow, and specifically there's an advanced creature tab, and click on there, you can get to where you're supposed to go, and all the people in the class who are running this will be checking in and can help provide answers and feedback to anything that comes up. Now, what are you going to learn? This is now where we're getting into the more general or theoretical sort of issue. You're not, oops, I lost their sentence. What you're not going to learn is hardcore anatomy facts. This won't be an A&P course, because then it would take a semester and you come out at the end just having memorized a lot of facts, and it wouldn't really just help you design as much as I'd like. What you are going to learn are how major parts of the anatomy affect each other. That is, when you're going through and designing something, how like picking one part of an existing animal would affect how another part should be, and then how to kind of mix and match those so that by the end you should feel really comfortable if you're sitting down to design a small plant-eating animal that could have lived on another planet, or a giant flying meat-eating animal, or a fantasy animal. You can apply these concepts and feel like you're really making an impact on how your design looks and how believable it is when you're done. Or in short, when you're working at Pixar or ILM, and of course, as you know, Pixar and ILM uses old Dell computers just like this when they do their work. and you're working really hard in between playing Castleville when your director isn't looking, you don't come out with something just like this, where you're just stitching animals together. Instead, you want to feel how to blend parts of animals together in a plausible way to come up with totally new things that people will find realistic and also stunning because it's something no one's ever seen before. Now, we discussed in the webinar the idea of this mental toolkit where you can kind of choose parts of different animals and stitch together, but not come out with this. But I want to actually give you a specific example. We talked about dewbacks last week, and I'm sure all of you have seen Star Wars from time to time. The dewback is a fascinating animal in that the design really shows exactly what I'm talking about. If you were to break down the bits, the designer going through there very clearly gave it a dinosaur-style upper leg and tail, where it gave it a very mammal, she gave it a very mammal-like lower leg. The front end, the shoulders and the neck and the arms are all mammal-like, but the feet are not just dinosaur-like, but they're like the hind feet of dinosaurs, even the ones on the front. And then, of course, there's a lizard-like skull and set of scales over it. Okay, for this reason, we will be looking a lot at dinosaurs and mammals. And that's because they provide such a great contrast, and they're the two groups who most commonly filled our history as the sort of large, charismatic megafauna, the big guys who ran around and would end up in the pages of National Geographic when you took pictures. And as such, they sort of provide a good example there. We will be, I should say it's not really dinosaurs versus mammals as much as it's comparing them. And so when we look at them today, as we go over gross anatomy, I'm going to have a whole series of resources for you where I've gone through and looked at different groups and I've color-coded all these similar parts. And I just wanted to let you know that these will be available on the course page later this week. There'll be a whole series of them, including the human ones. So if you are like brand new to anatomy, or perhaps you had human anatomy but you have a comparative anatomy, it'll be really easy to start associating the parts together. I apologize for the sort of psychedelic coloring, but it turns out there's not that many colors that like really show apart that easily without getting kind of obnoxious. Now, if you saw last week, I did talk about how there are these great proto-mammals, these things that were big land animals. Yeah, you'll have these refs. These big land animals that lived before the mammals that show a whole other way that mammals could have gone. And of course, there's this huge diversity of non-dinosaur relatives, the archosaurs, that also have great anatomy. I'm going to touch upon these more in subsequent weeks, but today, since we have a lot of ground to cover, we're really going to mostly concentrate on the occasional reference to crocs, and then otherwise our dinosaur and mammal groups. I did purposely pick both a gravoportal or very upright, non-flex-limbed set of dinosaurs and mammals, and then of course the flex-limbed ones that I showed you earlier. And I also purposely did not pick a two-legged meat-eating theropod because they tend to be so just dramatically awesome that they can overwhelm the conversation, but most everything that we talk about in these flex-limbed animals applies to meat-eating theropods also. Okay, so hopefully you have a good feeling now for what's going to come up in the subsequent month of classes, as well as what you're going to see today, and some of the references you'll get. There'll be more to come. Okay, speaking of which, let's go over anatomy just really quickly. So when you think about anatomy, there's a whole lot of terms you have to learn. In fact, it's worse than you might think. If you ever took like a human A&P course, it turns out that human anatomical terms and muscles don't even overlap perfectly with other mammal muscles names. And because veterinary medicine was developing before people sort of realized that all animals were related, things like birds and reptiles often have their own sets of names for parts of the bones or parts of the muscles. Obviously, that would be a really frustrating experience. In fact, let me tell you, it is a really frustrating experience. And so instead, we're really going to concentrate on the broad strokes. And we could go through, I could label all the bones. We could, go diagram all the muscles where they go and learn the names. But at the end, you just come to the conclusion that there's just a lot of facts you're memorizing, and it's not the understanding that you want to get. So rather than trying to have this happen, we're going to take the tact of someone, like say me, trying to fix a car. Now, you know, a lot of people who work on cars don't know much about, say, the physics of internal combustion or exactly why spark plugs work, but it's okay. They can still fix a lot of things in cars and understand it because you can take this more technical college approach where you're just understanding what you have to do. And that's kind of like the tact we're going to take. Now, this is more direct repair, whereas I'm going to give you more concepts, but this is still the theme we're going for, is how you can get the maximum understanding with the minimum amount of having to memorize little detail-oriented things. However, that's not to say that it isn't good to know anatomy. Just like the absolute best car mechanics probably have a fantastic understanding of how every part of a car works and the physics and engineering behind it, the best designers would obviously have a really deep knowledge of anatomy, and I don't want to discourage you from it. It's just not something we can cover, you know, in a course of this nature. So what I am also going to provide to you is a brief little guide to dinosaur anatomy. It's not a guide to human or mammal anatomy because it's pretty easy to find those. And these sheets, I'll just show them to you real briefly here, will also be available as a resource if you are not a specialist in anatomy and you kind of want to get a feel for it. There'll be a list of how to use terms for front to back and up and down and closer or further away from the limbs. There is going to be a list of bones. I'm purposely, as much as possible, going to use human anatomy terms there in case you have had human anatomy or you're looking online for a comparison. Skull bones, the holes of the skull. These, by the way, will be really different by and large from what you see on mammal skulls. I can't help that. They're just really different. There'll be internal muscles and external muscles. So if you really want to learn these things, it'll be available, but that's literally as much as we're going to cover in terms of specifics there. So we're going to jump right into that anatomy toolkit in just a moment, but first I want to take just a quick break to see if there are any questions that I can deal with before I go on. We're going to have other Q&As later, so you don't have to like ask about the upcoming topics, but if there's any questions about the resources or what's going to happen in the class, now would be a great time.
And how this works, guys, you can just type your question into the chat window, and I see all me and Scott will see all the questions, and we can answer it from there. It's, this format isn't an open chat, just FYI.
Will, I'm just going to jump in. Hey guys, it's Ryan. Sorry I missed the beginning of class. So also, while you're typing up those questions, I got another question for you. How many ZBrushers do we have here, or digital sculptors? So I have a sense of what we're going to be doing next. Give me a shout out in chat on that. And then also your questions. All right, doesn't look like too many questions, but we got lots of ZBrushers. So we can probably just move forward. If there's any questions, we'll catch them in the next one-to-one. And Scott, you don't have any problem inlining those questions anyway, so.
No. Okay, well, let's jump right on in then, shall we? Okay, so today is the nuts and bolts. The technical term is gross anatomy. I don't mean gross anatomy, of course. What I actually mean is the big things that are easy to see. And if you think about it, these are the things that you usually want to have come first in your design. Because if you start working on a really cool looking hand or paw before you have the rest of the broad strokes down, you know, you're not going to really come up with an animal that's coherent. So in a way, I'm purposely trying to pace these first 2 weeks to mirror the design process that we most normally go through when coming up with stuff. And I'm sure many of you have done lots of drawings and sculptures and work roughly the same way. We're specifically going to cover necks, backs, and tails. We're going to look at ribs, we're going to look at hips and shoulders, and due to time constraints, we're going to talk a bit about forelimbs and hind limbs this week. but it'll be sort of a preview for bigger issues we'll cover next week before getting to the nitty-gritty. Okay, so here, of course, is the first place to go, backbones. The first thing in our dinosaurs v. mammals comparison to realize, and we touched upon this in the webinar a couple weeks ago, is that dinosaurs have absolutely massive vertebrae for their size. These are actually roughly similarly sized animals, believe it or not, and you can look at the, in comparison, dinky, pathetic little vertebrae down the back and then the neck compared to this horned dinosaur. And people, you know, we actually have surprisingly big vertebrae in our back because we're walking upright, but even then the centrum, the little round part that does the actual support, is just this little part here. These are the spines which help support some of the muscles that hold this up. So even our backbones, the structural part is quite dinky, and the whole thing is still quite small compared to any self-respecting dinosaur. Now, this is true across essentially all size classes of dinosaurs. Small dinosaurs still have bigger ones. Massive ones, like these giant, you know, earth-shaking sauropods, have truly enormous backbones in some cases, whereas elephants get a bit of a high neural spine. The spine is the part that supports the muscle, again, that holds up the head, but otherwise the actual support part, really tiny, small, even on an animal that weighs, in this case, you know, 6 to 8 tons or more in the case of big trophy-sized specimens. And I think this is important because, bizarrely, if you think about like 100 years ago, people were like, whoa, how could these animals have supported themselves? You know, they're so big. But the funny thing is, you can get away with surprisingly small vertebrae as long as you don't stress them too much. And of course, the other thing that's funny is that dinosaurs simply don't have vertebrae like that. They have massively over-engineered vertebrae. If you look at crocs and other non-dinosaurs, you'll see that actually this massive over-engineered vertebral column is a dinosaur specialty. So you are definitely borrowing a dinosaur-type vertebral column if you go that route. And there are good ways to do that because, of course, big active animals or big active creatures you might design would benefit from that sort of vertebral structure. Now, let's briefly talk about why this is. The short answer here, don't worry about the names of these dinosaurs, these are incredibly primitive dinosaurs that, although they look alike, help give rise to fairly different types of dinosaurs. The key is that while the earliest dinosaurs are not themselves terribly huge, they pretty much go right away into adapting to the big land animal role, the big charismatic megafauna that if we could travel through time, we'd make, you know, coffee table books out of them. Whereas mammals, who appeared around the same time as the first dinosaurs, started out, you know, proto-mammals are in the same size range, and they went through this tiny little size squeeze, and basically the first 2/3 of mammal time was spent being small. I mean, the first 2/3, the biggest mammals anywhere are like the size of a raccoon, and most of them have long, flexible backs that are great for digging burrows and getting through them or climbing up trees and wriggling around in them. And so basically nowadays we've had to undo that if we want to go anywhere. So in short, here's a quick summary of that. Mammals spent most of their history being small. Dinosaur backs tend to be shorter relative to mammals and are almost always relatively inflexible. And mammals who have primitively flexible backs have to undo it if they want to get big. Now, flexible backs aren't inherently bad. You can do some really neat things with them. Ask that snake question at the next Q&A, please. That's a good question. Flexible backs can, for example, increase how far you step. Cheetahs run incredibly fast, in large part because they have what's called dorsiflexion. They can flex their back vertebrae up and down, literally lengthening and shortening the body and using the trunk muscles to help propel it along. I don't know if I mentioned this last time in the free webinar, I may have, but some person who had more time on his hands than perhaps sense calculated that if you took a cheetah and, hypothetically speaking, amputated all of its limbs, that it would still be able to sort of inchworm along at close to 30 miles an hour because of just how much extra speed and limb length is contributed by that that moving of the back in the run. I suspect if you were to test this in reality, the cheetah would not run very far. Okay, so big mammals. There obviously are big mammals, and the funny thing is, if you look at an elephant back, even elephants that perform in the circus and rear up and stand on their hind legs, what you'll see is the back is now secondarily stiff. Even though it's not massive, they've had to go to a lot of trouble to go ahead and make it not nearly as flexible as sort of the primitive mammal condition. And this is true even of kind of medium-sized animals, although I realize if you've ever been up to close to a horse, they don't seem so medium-sized if they step on your feet. But even medium-sized animals that run around, like horses or deer, stiffen up the back a lot to allow it as a platform for running in the ungulate or hoofed mammal style. So there's a lot to be said for stiff backs, even if mammals have to go to a lot of trouble just to get there. What does this mean for you? Well, if you're going to make an animal, a creature on another planet who's tearing through shrubs and bushes and chasing your protagonist or eating lawyers or what have you, if they have to be really active and they have to be large, you really probably want to look at that more over-engineered, stiffer-backed concept, which also means usually shorter backs, as a basis for your design. Really long, slinky, lizard-like backs or mammal backs can look cool. They can do lots of sort of animation tricks, but they're probably not, unless it's absolutely required as a design point for your creature, they're probably not the most plausible way to go if you're looking for realism.
Scott, can I interrupt 1 sec?
Yeah, please.
Can you tell me what you mean by secondarily stiffen the spine?
Sure. If you look at individual vertebrae, they have parts that kind of define how much they can move. Not the big flat faces that touch. They have other little overlapping bits, which are called zygapophyses. You don't need to know that. There won't be a test. And how much those overlap kind of defines and how big they are, like how much motion is possible. And all animals with backbones spend quite a bit of time modifying those pre- and post-zygapophyses. Post-zygapophyses sounds like a cereal, breakfast cereal you could pour milk on, but so that you can, so they can constrain how they can move. Sometimes animals will constrain it so they have motion maybe in the up and down, but not side to side direction. Sometimes the other way around. Sometimes they make them, they design them so that they're large and have a very broad contact, so they have lots of motion in all directions. Somebody asked the question about snakes, and this would be a good point to interject there. If you look at a snake vertebrae, it's instantly recognizable because it has a truly ludicrous amount of like motion-based engineering to it, if you will, like the way those bits that overlap are shaped in order to let them have as much range of motion as they need. I don't have any pictures of snake vertebrae with me, I'm afraid, but the internet, of course.
So if you go back to that last photo, then secondarily stiffening mean the one before this, sorry. So the neural spines, those are secondarily stiffening this up, then, right?
Well, in this case, the neural spines are to a degree because, of course, they can't overlap, so they do define how much it can bend upward. Mm-hmm. That's a good point. But there's actually the little zygapophyses, once again to use that word, apologies to those of you who are word phobic, are really quite small in elephants, surprisingly so, and that also constrains how much they move, because if it moves too much, they would literally like pull apart, and it'd be sort of the equivalent of dislocating your shoulder or your hip.
Okay.
And that would cause pain right away, because, you know, all animals have these little tissues that wrap around their joints that have nerves in them, and if you pull on those too much, you feel it right away for a good reason, because it's nature's way of saying, stop whatever you are doing.
All right, and then very large vertebrae just naturally stiffen it because of the range of motion and relative to the size of the vertebrae.
You know, they don't. You can design, whale vertebrae are quite flexible. You can design a big vertebrae that will be flexible, but land animals never do that because you have to fight against gravity on land.
Okay.
So pretty much, if you want an animal that weighs a ton or 2 or 3 and you want it to chase around through brush, really the shorter, stiffer back is the way to go. And these are relative statements. I don't mean they have to be the exact same size, but from a design concept, that is really a good way to go for your big, charismatic actor chasing and consuming type of creature.
All right, so it's shorter and stiffer or longer and flexible?
Yeah. Obviously, you don't have to think about how you'll actually draw the zygapophyses when designing your animal, but that is what constrains it.
Got it.
Another fact here that I just tossed up is if you're going to go with this sort of dinosaur-style backbone, you can do something that you almost never see, or you don't see often enough, in my opinion, outside of actual movie dinosaurs, which is you can go ahead and show the ridge, the muscle ridge from the spine, the backbone, extending well up and over the hips and shoulders. Here's an example. Here's a big dinosaur. It's called the Apatosaurus. And you'll notice that there's this giant bone and muscle area way up here over where the hips start and where the shoulders start. Now, mammals don't usually do this. I mean, a few things like buffalo do it right up front with the hump up here, but most of that's because they're turning the whole neck down. But if you just need a big active animal, you can go ahead and do this. It gives you a whole new way to come up with design contours for the back, how the animal looks in profile as it's like backlighted running through the brush to chase your heroes or heroines. So it gives you actually a lot of design freedom once you sort of break that the pelvis has to be affixed to the top or near the top of the backbone conceit that mammals bring. Here, of course, is an example where you can see the pelvis here would come literally right to the top. Ours, you actually hide it. But even in this dinosaur, which has a relatively low spine, it still clearly sticks up above the pelvis and well above the shoulders. Okay, now of course, backbones aren't just one continuous section. There are multiple sections to these, and how you design them does have an influence on the other parts. Or, as I'd say, it impacts, for example, something we covered last week, or a couple weeks ago in the webinar, stiff backs impact neck design. Animals with stiff backs are inevitably the ones that have long necks. That doesn't mean all animals with stiff backs have long necks. You can get away with a short neck just fine, although with a stiff back and a short neck, you're very limited in sort of where you can stick your head. So if you're a small little shuffling animal that just eats off the ground, that's not a problem. But because the backs are less mobile, it tends to do two things at one, creates a need, that is a need to have a long neck so that you can reach the ground or wherever you're foraging easily. But two, it also creates a more powerful platform to withstand the forces of a long neck. If you can imagine, this animal has a neck that probably weighs, more than a horse all by itself. And if it were to move the head with any kind of swiftness from side to side, and it had a flexible back, imagine like how much that would be trying to move the backbone on you and how much muscle effort would be required to sort of oppose it. And having a stiff back sort of negates that. It just provides you a rigid beam. Yeah, stiff backs and flexible necks are generally the rule. You can have animals that stiffen the neck up in the middle. They still have stiff backs, though. And, of course, I covered this last week, but as sort of the exception that proves the rule, mammals with their primitively flexible backs rarely lengthen their necks a whole lot, but the ones that do, like giraffes, have very stiff, very short backs by mammal standards in order to allow it, because they would have the exact same problems otherwise. And as one other thing, I didn't mention this at all last week, so sort of a, hey, look how true this is. If you even look at giant extinct marine animals, you can have animals with long, flexible backs. Notice how most of the rib area is totally free. Each of these is highly mobile. That is, their zygapophyses allow them to move a whole lot, and they have these short, puny little necks and relatively large heads. By the way, primitive whales look exactly like this too. I mean, obviously they look like mammals, but they basically do the exact same thing. Whereas the long-necked plesiosaurs have much shorter backs, and they go to all this effort to increase the parts underneath the arms and underneath the pelvis, and they add all this extra reinforced bone here to basically tighten all this up into a stiff little body cavity, both on the top and, as you can see out here, this is the bottom, in order to reinforce that to give them the solid platform for the long, flexible neck to operate from. So this is one of those rules that if you were going to violate it, you'd really want to explain to your TV and your animator and your riggers, it's going to have consequences. You have a long, flexible back and a long, flexible neck. When that neck moves, it needs to be moving that back. Or just skip that, because realistically you don't really see animals with that combination. You get the short, inflexible backs to support long, flexible necks. And I don't know if you guys go to a lot of museums, but if you do, of course, these plesiosaurs have necks that can get up to well, I ran out of room, but they can get 2 or 3 times as long as this neck here. Well, 2 to 2.5. For a body that's still about the same size. So just a quick summary. Long necks pretty much always require stiff backs. I can't come up with a single real exception. Obviously, you could design an exception, but that would have real-world or hypothetical world impacts. I did mention not all stiff-backed animals have long necks. There are lots of dinosaurs that have fairly short necks. Even animals that start out with flexible backs always go to great lengths to shorten and stiffen them up, like giraffes when they do it. And as I just showed you, even aquatic animals do it. So really, this is a rule that's, if you're making an exception, you should realize why it's an exception and try to account for it, and otherwise simply avoid not having a shorter, stiffer back with your long-necked animals. The question as to how do you guys take a nap is actually a pretty good one for our summary right here. A lot of animals can actually largely go ahead and sleep upright. But despite that, most animals can lie down. And even though, you look at a big dinosaur and be like, how on earth could it have laid down? In reality, there aren't really any living land animals that can't seem to find a way to lean up against something and partially lay down. They could, of course, lean up against one another if they didn't want to. It might have taken quite a bit of effort to get back up, but most animals can lie down when push comes to shove. And if push really comes to shove, they have no choice about the lying down part. And as for aquatic animals, again, really, you don't see the combination. It would be possible, I would think, there because the motion of the back would not be so objectionable if you're swimming by flexing the whole animal. But again, it's generally a combination of even Tanystropheus, which is a very different sort of partially marine reptile, seems to not have had nearly as flexible of a back as its immediate relatives. Okay, so there are other parts of the animal besides the neck, of course. Let's go on to tails. We covered tails in some depth last week, so I'm going to skip over some of the muscly parts, but just so you know, because it is important, if you're going to have animals with, say, dinosaur hips, and we'll talk about hips later, really these big muscular tails are awfully handy because, of course, those muscles, seen right here as the tasty part of the alligator, is the biggest, strongest leg muscle. Its whole job is to pull the leg back. So while you don't have to have these in big animals, it is handy to have all that extra muscle there if, again, you're creating a big 2 or 3 or 4 ton animal that's chasing people around. There's sort of an examination of it in multiple views. This will be available as a resource also. And one thing I would note is even going back to the earliest animals with 4 legs who weren't even yet getting out of the water, that tail muscle pulling the leg back is already there. This is a key feature actually of non-mammals right from the beginning, and it's only mammals who lose it during that small hiding in holes or going up trees phase. And this animal here, for those who are interested, is Diplocaulus. It's a boomerang head proto-amphibian. It's if you saw it, you would want to call it a weird amphibian. It's not actually part of the modern amphibian group. It's more primitive even than that. Okay, so more about tails. Tails, being muscular, are a great place to put a weapon. They're probably less good in this glyptodont mammal, and yet it still did it. But tons of other animals have independently decided that the biggest muscles in my body, those tail muscles running down the side, are also really good at swinging this club-like or bat-like or whip-like thing that I have coming out of my rear at my enemies. Of course, armored dinosaurs are notorious for having done it. Yes, large tail muscles do give the leg more power for sure, but in this case, if you can think about it, a big sauropod has a tail which weighs as much as the meat eaters that are attacking it. You can imagine how even without anything special on there, just swinging it at them would be very much like taking a large metal bat to an unsuspecting home intruder. It just would be devastatingly effective. However, some early sauropods also came up with little clubs at the end, probably because having a little extra weight at the end of your tail helps it swing faster once it gets going and transfer more energy once it hits something. In much the same way, if you take a piece of string and a yo-yo and you swing them both around, having the yo-yo on the end of the string allows it to move much faster and hit a heck of a lot harder than just, say, swinging the string, obviously, or even a heavier rope. Long, skinny tails are also okay for balance. You'll see lots of mammals, like the cheetah that tries to turn fairly quickly as it runs, or animals that live in trees, like lemurs, will actually make their tails longer relative to their ancestors as an attempt to help balance. And if you think about it, that's pretty useful because when you're running or leaping, you can't do nearly as much with your feet to help readjust your center of gravity, that is your balance basically, if it happens to not be where it ought to be according to physics. And of course, if you can't fix that, then you nose plant, sometimes with truly drastic results. But if you have a long tail that's flexible and you can stick it places, you can help reshift your center of gravity without having to touch the ground again. You can do it on the fly. One thing I do want to point out here, only because it's so prevalent all over the interwebs as well as in books on dinosaurs, if you refer to them, is long, skinny, stiff tails, like velociraptor relatives like this Deinonychus are fairly famous for, are not good for adjusting balance. Unfortunately, when the very first Deinonychus was found, they found this section of this tail which has these long, overlapping, bony rods, which were thought to really stiffen the tail up. And right away, in the paper, an analogy was drawn to tightrope walkers with these long, stiff poles that use it to keep their balance. But this is actually a really bad solution because it's hard to take a stiff object and place it as precisely. No mammal, for example, that grows a long tail tries to stiffen them, and neither do like small meat-eating dinosaurs that have long, thin, heavy tails. They're quite flexible. This stiff thing in tightrope walkers is only there because, of course, it's an external object. You know, the tightrope walker has no bones and muscles in there. They can't. It's just picking something up, and so they have no choice but to use it. And as a result, it has to be much bigger because they have less flexibility. And still, all the actual use has to come from the flexible bits of the tightrope walker, the arms. So this is like sort of one of those prevalent myths that need to be like exorcised. In point of fact, long, skinny tails are probably only good for probably good for nothing unless you have an airfoil attached. That is to say, unless you have a big fan of feathers at the end of it. And it wouldn't have to be feathers. I mean, you could use some other skin flaps, scales, or something if you're designing your own creature, but you need to have something on the end generating a force. And to think about what I'm saying here, imagine having a broomstick and a rope. If you're generating power at the end of the rope, you still can't push anything. You can't have any impact on someone holding the other end of the rope, at least not without pulling. Whereas if you have the broomstick and someone's on the other end, or in this case the animal's butt is on the other end, then the force you generate out here works on it like a lever, allowing you to really impact which way the animal's body is facing and or readjusting its center of gravity. So this is a cool feature if you wanted to, you know, type it and add it to your creature designs, but it needs to work the one way it actually works. And we do now know that all these groups with short, stiff tails or long, stiff tails amongst dinosaurs, the meat-eating dinosaurs seem to have these fans of feathers at the end. So a quick summary there. I'm not going to say you have to make big active creatures have thick muscular tails for sure. Rhinos are big and they're pretty active. They can obviously pull it off. but it certainly has to help to have that extra muscle that powers your legs. It will certainly give you the ability to accelerate faster, to more powerfully run through trees or what have you. It's a good thing to go if you really want to have a whole lot of power in your oversized animals. It also gives you another way to design big animals that perhaps we don't see as often as we could. Big tails like that, they do sort of require the right kinds of hips and upper legs. It still leaves you a lot of freedom with the lower legs, but big muscular tails like that are sort of functionally linked to hips, and we'll talk about that more in a little bit. Long, thin tails, they're good for swatting flies, even short, thin tails, really. But they're also good for balance, and especially in tree climbing animals. You got to have flexibility up there, not just because it's better at helping you balance, but because there are branches and other things in there. And if you have if you're trying to climb around in a tree with a broomstick taped to your rear, let's just say you'll get stuck more than once, and it won't be a fun experience. Also, that'd be some really good tape. I'm just saying. Finally, long, stiff tails are a very specialized, a specialty bit of anatomy, but they're not good for what the web says they're good for. They're not actually good for helping you turn unless they have something at the end of it to generate force.